Lieutenant Commander Raven Ghost Nakamura had been enjoying the relative anonymity of a corner booth at Tony's Diner, 3 miles outside Naval Air Station Oceana. The greasy spoon served coffee that could wake the dead and burgers that reminded her why she joined the Navy in the first place, for adventure, not cuisine. She'd been mechanically working through a club sandwich, her mind still processing the morning's flight debrief, when the shadow fell across her table. Two men in civilian clothes slid into the booth opposite her. Their bearing screamed military despite the khakis and polo shirts. The taller one, with silver threading his temples and scars that spoke of operations that didn't make the evening news, placed a manila folder on the worn formica between the ketchup and her half-empty coffee cup. His companion, younger but carrying the same aura of controlled violence, kept his hands visible but ready. "Lieutenant Commander Nakamura," the older man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We need to talk." Ghost set down her sandwich slowly, her pilot's instincts cataloging exits, potential weapons, and the fact that every other patron in the diner had suddenly found their meals fascinating. The folder bore no markings, no classification stamps, nothing to indicate what lay inside. But the weight of it, the way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, told her everything she needed to know. "Gentlemen," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to sing in her veins, "I'm off duty, whatever this is." "This is about Operation Nightfall," the younger operative interrupted, then caught a sharp look from his partner. "Too much, too fast." Ghost filed that away. She'd never heard of Operation Nightfall. But the way her stomach dropped, the way the diner's fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, and the conversation at the next table too loud, told her that was about to change. In 12 years of naval aviation, she'd flown combat missions over 3 continents, logged more hours in hostile airspace than most pilots saw in their entire careers, and earned call signs that other aviators whispered with mixture of respect and bewilderment. Ghost reached for the folder. Her fingers, steady enough to thread a Super Hornet through a thunderstorm at Mach 1.2, trembled almost imperceptibly as they touched the manila edge. Whatever was inside would change everything. She could feel it in her bones, the way she'd always been able to sense turbulence before the instruments caught it. The older operative, she was already thinking of him as Control, leaned forward slightly. "What we're about to show you never happened. The mission we're going to ask you to fly doesn't exist, and if things go wrong—" He paused, his gray eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "Well, let's just say Tony here makes a hell of a memorial burger." Ghost flipped open the folder. The first photograph was of an aircraft she'd never seen before, sleek and predatory, its lines suggesting technology that shouldn't exist yet. The second was a satellite image of what looked like a fortress carved into a mountainside, complete with surface-to-air missile installations and enough armed personnel to invade a small country. The third photograph made her blood run cold. It was her father's squadron patch from Vietnam, the one that had supposedly been destroyed along with all records of his final mission 43 years ago. The patch that had haunted her dreams since she was old enough to understand that some pilots never came home, and some secrets were buried so deep that even death couldn't reach them. "How?" The word came out as a whisper. Control's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Your father wasn't flying a routine reconnaissance mission when he went down over Laos in 1981, Commander. He was testing something. Something that the enemy has now managed to reverse engineer and weaponize." He gestured to the mysterious aircraft in the first photograph. "We need someone who can think like he did, fly like he did. Someone who understands that sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to finish what they started." Ghost stared at the patch, her thumb tracing the faded threads of the squadron insignia she'd memorized from the single photograph her mother had kept hidden in a shoebox for over 4 decades. The Phantom Eagles, a squadron that, according to official records, had never existed. "What makes you think I can do what he couldn't?" she asked, though she already knew she was going to say yes. Some things were written in blood and passed down through generations like genetic code. The younger operative spoke for the first time since his slip. "Because, Commander, you're not just his daughter, you're Ghost." He said her call sign like a prayer, and suddenly she understood. They hadn't come to her because she was available. They'd come because she was inevitable. Control reached across the table and turned to the next page in the folder. It was a mission brief, dense with technical specifications and threat assessments that would have made a lesser pilot reconsider their career choices. But Ghost read it like sheet music, her mind already calculating angles of approach, fuel consumption, and exit strategies. "The target is a weapons development facility in the Carpathian Mountains," Control explained as she read. "Intelligence suggests they're 48 hours from operational capability with a weapons system that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in Eastern Europe. We need someone to get in, gather intelligence, and if necessary, ensure that technology never sees daylight." "Define if necessary," Ghost said without looking up from the brief. "Whatever it takes, Commander, whatever it takes." She closed the folder and met his eyes. In the fluorescent buzz of Tony's diner, with the smell of hash browns and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate, Raven Nakamura made a decision that would either cement her legacy or ensure she joined her father in whatever classified cemetery held pilots who flew missions that never happened. "When do we leave?" Control smiled, and for the first time since sitting down, he looked genuinely pleased. "Pack light, Commander. Wheels up in 6 hours." He stood, his companion following suit. "And Ghost, this time we're all coming home." As they walked away, leaving her alone with a folder full of state secrets and a half-eaten sandwich growing cold, Ghost realized she was no longer having lunch alone. She was having lunch with every pilot who'd ever strapped into a cockpit knowing they might not come back, every aviator who'd chosen duty over safety, and every daughter who'd grown up wondering if she was brave enough to finish her father's fight. She signaled for the check and began to plan for war. The drive back to Oceana gave Ghost time to process what she'd agreed to, though processing and accepting were two entirely different animals. The folder lay on her passenger seat like a sleeping cobra, innocuous until you remembered what kind of venom it carried. She'd memorized every page during the 20-minute briefing in Tony's back office, a windowless room that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and secrets. The aircraft was designated XF-47 Wraith, a prototype stealth fighter that officially didn't exist and unofficially represented 30 years of black-budget development. Single-seat, twin-engine, capable of sustained Mach 2.5 flight with a service ceiling that brushed the edge of space. More importantly, it incorporated technology recovered from her father's crash site, technology that had taken 4 decades to understand, let alone replicate. As she pulled into the base, Ghost couldn't shake the feeling that she was driving toward destiny rather than duty. Her quarters in the bachelor officer's quarters felt smaller than usual as she packed the regulation duffel bag. Flight suits, survival gear, personal effects that would fit in a shoebox if necessary. She paused over her father's photograph, the only one she'd kept where he was in uniform. Lieutenant Commander James Phantom Nakamura, standing beside an F-4 Phantom II at Da Nang Air Base, 1980. He looked impossibly young, impossibly confident, impossibly alive. She'd inherited his eyes dark brown, almost black, and according to her mother, his inability to back down from a challenge. Looking at him now, knowing what she knew about his final mission, she wondered if he'd felt this same mixture of excitement and dread. Her secure phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, Hangar 18 2100 hours, come alone. Ghost checked her watch, 1847 hours. Enough time for a shower and a final check of her gear, not enough time to second-guess herself into backing out. She'd learned long ago that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was deciding that whatever you were afraid of wasn't as important as whatever you were fighting for. The shower was scalding, the way she preferred before difficult missions. It helped her focus, stripped away everything that wasn't essential. By the time she stepped out, she wasn't Lieutenant Commander Raven Nakamura anymore. She was Ghost, and Ghost had work to do. Hangar 18 sat on the far edge of the base, separated from the main flight line by distance and bureaucracy. As she approached, Ghost noticed the unusual lack of security. No guards, no checkpoints, just a keypad lock that accepted the code Control had given her. Inside, the hangar was dark except for work lights focused on the center of the floor. The XF-47 Wraith crouched there like a sleeping predator, its angular surfaces drinking light rather than reflecting it. It was smaller than she'd expected, more elegant, as if someone had distilled the essence of flight into its purest, deadliest form. The cockpit was open, revealing an interior that looked more like a spacecraft than anything she'd flown before. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Control's voice came from the shadows near the hangar office. He stepped into the light, now dressed in operational fatigues that bore no insignia, no indication of branch or rank. "Your father helped design the original propulsion system. It's taken us 40 years to build an aircraft worthy of his vision." Ghost circled the aircraft, her trained eye cataloging details that would matter in flight. What happened to him really happened, not the official story. He was testing the prototype over contested airspace when enemy fighters engaged him. The aircraft was damaged but not destroyed. Your father managed to complete the mission and transmit crucial telemetry before being forced down. Control's voice carried genuine respect. He bought us the data we needed with his life. The technology in this aircraft exists because of his sacrifice. And now you need me to finish what he started. The enemy has had 40 years to reverse engineer what they recovered from that crash site. They've built something we can't counter with conventional aircraft. Control gestured to the Wraith. "This is our answer, but it takes a special kind of pilot to fly it. Someone who understands that some missions are more important than the people who fly them." Ghost reached out and touched the aircraft's skin. It was warm, as if the machine was alive, waiting. "When do I meet the rest of the team?" Control's silence stretched long enough to answer the question. Ghost turned to face him, understanding dawning like ice water in her veins. "There is no team, is there? The mission requires complete deniability. One aircraft, one pilot, one chance to get it right." His expression was apologetic but unyielding. "If you're captured or killed, the technology dies with you. The aircraft has a self-destruct system that will leave nothing but scattered atoms. From an operational standpoint, you'll be completely expendable." Ghost nodded slowly. She'd suspected as much from the moment they'd approached her in the diner. "And personally?" For the first time since meeting him, Control's professional mask slipped. "Personally, Commander, I served with your father in Vietnam. I was supposed to be on that final mission with him, but I was grounded with a broken arm from a training accident. He flew alone because the mission couldn't wait." He paused, looking older than his years. "I've spent 40 years wondering what would have happened if I'd been there. Now I'm asking his daughter to fly an even more dangerous mission, alone, based on technology he died to protect. Sounds like you're giving me the chance to answer that question." Control smiled grimly. "Your father would be proud, Ghost, and probably terrified." The briefing that followed was detailed enough to kill a lesser pilot with information overload, but Ghost absorbed it like a sponge absorbs water, completely and instinctively. The target facility was carved into Mount Amu in Romania, built inside a natural cave system that provided both concealment and protection. Intelligence suggested the enemy had developed a new class of air defense system, using technology recovered from her father's aircraft. Systems that could track and engage stealth aircraft with unprecedented accuracy. "The mission profile is elegant in its simplicity," Control explained as they reviewed satellite imagery. "Insert at low altitude using terrain masking to avoid radar detection. Penetrate the facility's airspace during their morning patrol change. a 17-minute window when their coverage is reduced by approximately 30%. Gather intelligence on their weapons development program, and if possible, eliminate their ability to weaponize the technology. Ghost studied the flight path, her mind automatically calculating fuel consumption, threat windows, and abort criteria. What about extraction? Same route reversed. The aircraft has sufficient fuel for the round trip with a 30-minute combat reserve. Control paused. However, given the advanced nature of their air defense systems, extraction may be complicated. You mean unlikely? I mean complicated, Commander. Unlikely implies we don't think you can do it. We wouldn't ask if we didn't believe you were the best pilot for the job. Ghost appreciated the careful phrasing, but she understood the reality. This was a one-way mission disguised as a round trip, a suicide run with enough plausible deniability to let everyone sleep better at night. She'd flown missions with longer odds, but never one where success and survival were mutually exclusive concepts. I'll need technical specs on the aircraft systems, detailed intelligence on the target, and a secure communication protocol for mission updates. Already prepared, Control handed her a tablet loaded with encrypted files. Study these tonight. We launch at 300 local time. That puts you over target during their patrol change window. As Ghost prepared to leave, Control called her name. She turned back to find him standing beside the Wraith, his hand resting on its wing like a benediction. "Your call sign," he said. "Where did it come from?" Ghost considered the question, remembering flight school, remembering her first squadron assignment, remembering the gradual evolution from Lieutenant Nakamura to Ghost. "My instructors said I had a habit of appearing where I shouldn't be and disappearing when I should be found. They meant it as criticism. And you turned it into a weapon." "I turned it into a tool. Everything else depends on how you use it." Control nodded slowly. "Your father's call sign was Phantom for similar reasons. Maybe it runs in the family." "Maybe," Ghost agreed. "Or maybe some things are just inevitable." She left him standing beside the aircraft in the pool of work lights, looking like a mechanic attending to a sleeping god of war. Outside, the Virginia night was clear and cold, stars visible despite the base lighting. In 8 hours, she'd be flying toward mountains she'd never seen, to stop a weapon she didn't fully understand, using technology that existed because her father had died protecting it. As she walked back to her quarters, Ghost realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Fear required uncertainty, and there was nothing uncertain about tomorrow's mission. She would fly, she would fight, and she would either succeed or die trying. The variables were tactical: fuel, weather, enemy capabilities, equipment reliability. The mission itself had become as inevitable as sunrise. In her quarters, she spread the mission files across her desk and began to study. By 200 hours, she had memorized every detail, every contingency, every specification that might make the difference between success and failure. She'd also written a letter to her mother, explaining nothing and everything, to be delivered only if she didn't return. At 2:45 hours, Ghost walked back to Hangar 18 for the last time as a pilot who flew missions that officially existed. When she returned, if she returned, she would be something else entirely. Something that lived in the spaces between truth and fiction, between history and legend. The XF-47 Wraith was waiting for her, fueled and armed and ready to carry her toward whatever destiny waited in the Carpathian Mountains. As she began her pre-flight inspection, Ghost wondered if her father had felt this same sense of completion, this understanding that some flights were ends rather than beginnings. She was about to find out. The Wraith's engine startup sequence was unlike anything Ghost had experienced in over a decade of flying military aircraft. Instead of the familiar whine of turbofans spooling up, the engines produced a low harmonic hum that seemed to resonate through the hangar's steel framework. The sound was almost musical, as if the aircraft was singing itself to life. Control appeared at her cockpit ladder as she completed her systems check. His expression was grim but determined, the look of a man sending someone he cared about into harm's way. "Final weather update," he said, handing her a folded paper. "You'll have clear skies over the target area, winds from the northwest at 15 knots, cloud ceiling at Angels 25, which should provide adequate concealment during your ingress." Ghost nodded, tucking the weather report into her flight suit pocket. She'd memorized the forecast hours ago, but the ritual of last-minute updates was as much about psychological preparation as tactical necessity. Communications protocol. Radio silence until your feet wet on the return leg. If you encounter trouble over the target, transmit on emergency frequency 243. We'll have assets standing by, but response time will be— He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Limited." "Understood." Ghost secured her helmet and began the final checklist sequence. Each switch, each setting, each system status check brought her closer to the moment when she would no longer be sitting safely on the ground but flying toward whatever waited in the Romanian mountains. "Anything else I need to know?" Control was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the cockpit rail. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 4 decades of military service. "Your father's last transmission was mission accomplished, going dark. We never heard from him again, but the telemetry data he sent saved American lives and changed how we approach aerial warfare. If things go badly tomorrow—" "They won't," Ghost interrupted, but not unkindly. She understood his need to say the words, to offer whatever comfort he could in the face of sending her on a mission with odds that would make Las Vegas bookmakers weep. "If they do," Control continued, "remember that some victories are measured in decades, not minutes. What you accomplish tomorrow might not pay dividends for years, but it will pay them." Ghost extended her gloved hand, and Control shook it with the solemnity of a final salute. "Take care of yourself, Ghost. The world's going to need pilots like you for a long time to come." As he stepped away from the aircraft, Ghost completed her engine startup and began taxiing toward the runway. The Wraith moved with an almost supernatural grace, its landing gear absorbing imperfections in the tarmac that would have jarred a conventional aircraft. Through her heads-up display, she could see Control standing outside the hangar, a solitary figure growing smaller as she rolled toward her takeoff position. The runway stretched ahead of her like a dark river, bordered by the familiar blue lights that had guided countless aircraft into the unknown. At the far end, she could see the approach lights of other runways, other aircraft preparing for missions that would be logged and recorded and remembered. Her mission would exist only in the memories of those who planned it, and the classified files that would be buried so deep that future historians would never suspect its existence. Ghost ran through her final pre-takeoff checks, each item on the list a small ceremony of preparation. Fuel quantity, sufficient for the mission plus reserve. Weapons systems, armed and ready. Navigation, programmed and verified. Communications, encrypted and secure. Life support, functioning nominally. She paused at the last item on her personal checklist, one that didn't appear in any manual. Courage holding steady. She keyed the radio for her final transmission from American airspace. Oceana Tower, Ghost requesting departure clearance. Ghost, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 5 left, winds calm, have a safe flight. The tower controller's voice was routine, professional, unaware that he was clearing an aircraft that didn't exist for a mission that would never appear in the official logs. Ghost advanced the throttles, feeling the Wraith's engines respond with smooth, overwhelming power. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with an urgency that pressed her back into her seat, the familiar sensation of rotation lifting her from the world of concrete and steel into the realm where she truly lived. As the landing gear retracted and Oceana fell away beneath her, Ghost realized she was no longer flying alone. Every pilot who had ever faced impossible odds was with her, every aviator who had chosen duty over safety, every warrior who had understood that some battles must be fought regardless of the cost. The cockpit felt crowded with ghosts, her father's phantom presence strongest among them. She turned toward the Atlantic, beginning the long journey that would take her across the dark ocean, over sleeping European cities, and finally to the mountains where technology stolen from her father's grave waited to be reclaimed or destroyed. Below, the lights of Virginia's coast slipped past like scattered stars, each one representing lives that might depend on her success without ever knowing her name. The Wraith climbed steadily through the night sky, its stealth characteristics rendering it invisible to radar systems that would have easily tracked conventional aircraft. Ghost monitored her instruments with the focused attention of a surgeon, noting fuel flow rates, engine temperatures, and navigation waypoints with practiced precision. Everything was functioning perfectly, as if the aircraft had been built specifically for her hands, her reflexes, her particular blend of skill and instinct. At 35,000 feet, she leveled off and engaged the autopilot for the long cruise across the Atlantic. The ocean below was invisible in the darkness, but she could sense its presence like a vast living thing, breathing in swells and currents that connected distant continents. Somewhere down there, submarines from various nations prowled the depths, their crews unaware that an aircraft their sensors couldn't detect was passing overhead at nearly twice the speed of sound. Ghost used the cruise phase to review her mission profile one final time, though she'd memorized every detail hours ago. The repetition was meditative, a way of preparing her mind for the violence that awaited. She visualized each phase of the mission, the low-level approach through the Carpathian valleys, the climb to attack altitude, the brief window when she would be most vulnerable to enemy fire, the escape route that would either carry her home or become her final flight path. Halfway across the Atlantic, she encountered the first complication. A storm system that wasn't supposed to exist according to her weather briefing had formed over the North Sea, its towering cumulonimbus clouds reaching well into her planned flight path. The Wraith's weather radar painted the system as a wall of red and yellow, indicating turbulence that could tear a lesser aircraft apart. She had two choices: climb over it, which would increase her fuel consumption and potentially compromise her stealth profile, or go around it, which would add precious minutes to her flight time and throw off her carefully calculated approach schedule. Ghost chose a third option. She dove beneath the storm, dropping to 15,000 feet where the air was smoother but the radar coverage more dense. It was a calculated risk. Flying lower increased her chances of detection, but kept her on schedule and preserved fuel. As she descended through the storm's lower reaches, the Wraith shuddered slightly in the turbulence, reminding her that even the most advanced aircraft was subject to the same natural forces that had challenged aviators since the Wright brothers. The storm passed like a fever dream of lightning and wind shear, and she emerged into clear air over the European mainland with her schedule intact and her fuel consumption still within acceptable parameters. Below, the lights of cities she couldn't name twinkled like earthbound constellations, each one representing thousands of lives that would continue their routine existence unaware that their security might depend on the success of a mission they would never know about. As she approached her initial point for the low-level phase of the mission, Ghost felt the familiar transformation that preceded combat. Her awareness sharpened, her reflexes quickened, and her mind entered the state of hyper-alert calm that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous missions. She was no longer simply flying an aircraft. She was becoming part of it, her consciousness expanding to include every system, every capability, every limitation. The Carpathian Mountains rose ahead of her like sleeping giants, their peaks catching starlight and holding it like silver crowns. Somewhere among those peaks, in a facility that existed in the spaces between official maps and satellite imagery, an enemy was preparing to deploy technology that could shift the balance of power in ways that would reshape the world. Ghost's mission was to ensure that never happened, regardless of the personal cost. She descended toward the mountains, leaving the familiar world of high-altitude flight for the dangerous realm of nap-of-the-earth navigation. At this altitude, there was no room for error, no time for second thoughts, no possibility of abort except through success or death. The Wraith responded to her controls with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, following terrain contours that would have challenged a seasoned bush pilot in a small aircraft. As she threaded between mountain peaks that seemed close enough to touch, Ghost realized she was no longer flying toward her father's legacy. She was living it, breathing it, becoming it. Whatever happened in the next 30 minutes would either vindicate his sacrifice or join it in the classified graveyards where heroes were buried without names or recognition. The target facility appeared on her instruments like a malignant tumor growing from the mountainside. Ghost armed her weapons systems and prepared to engage. The weapons facility revealed itself gradually as Ghost approached from the northwest, exactly as the satellite imagery had indicated. What the intelligence briefings hadn't conveyed was the sense of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the installation like heat from a forge. Cut into the living rock of Mount Amu, the facility was both fortress and laboratory, its entrance guarded by surface-to-air missile batteries that tracked restlessly across the pre-dawn sky. Ghost activated her targeting systems, watching as the Wraith's sophisticated sensors began cataloging threats and potential targets. The installation was more heavily defended than the briefings had suggested, at least 6 SAM sites, multiple radar installations, and what appeared to be a squadron of fighter aircraft parked in hardened shelters carved into the mountain itself. She'd expected tough opposition, but this looked like a declaration of war disguised as a research facility. Flying at barely 200 feet above the valley floor, Ghost threaded the Wraith between radar coverage zones with the precision of a seamstress working with invisible thread. The aircraft's stealth characteristics were impressive, but she knew that, at this range, even stealth had its limitations. If the enemy's air defense systems were based on technology recovered from her father's aircraft, they might be specifically designed to counter stealth capabilities. Her suspicions were confirmed when the first missile launch alarm sounded in her cockpit. The SA-21 Growler that rose from its concealed launcher moved with the lazy grace of a predator that knows its prey has no escape. Ghost watched its approach on her threat display, noting the missile's trajectory and calculating her response with the cold precision of a mathematician solving a deadly equation. The weapon was tracking her despite her stealth characteristics, confirming that the enemy had indeed reverse-engineered technology from her father's crash. She broke hard left, diving toward the valley floor while dispensing chaff and flares in a pattern designed to confuse the incoming missile's guidance systems. The Wraith's airframe groaned under the G-forces as she pulled the aircraft through a series of evasive maneuvers that would have killed a lesser pilot. Behind her, the SAM detonated in a flower of orange fire, close enough to rattle her teeth but far enough away to leave the aircraft undamaged. "Well," Ghost murmured to herself, "now they know I'm here." The enemy response was immediate and overwhelming. Every air defense system on the mountain lit up simultaneously, creating a cone of overlapping radar coverage that turned the night sky into a killing field. More missiles launched from concealed positions, their exhaust trails scribing deadly calligraphy across the darkness. Ghost found herself flying through a three-dimensional maze of threats, each one capable of ending her mission and her life with equal efficiency. But this was what she'd trained for, what she'd been born for. Ghost threw the Wraith into a series of violent maneuvers that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. She dove toward the valley floor, pulled up at the last possible second, rolled inverted to avoid a missile that passed close enough to count rivets, and throughout it all maintained her course toward the facility's primary target. The intelligence data indicated that the enemy's main laboratory was located in a natural cavern approximately 300 meters below the mountain's peak. To reach it, she would need to penetrate the facility's outer defenses, locate the cavern entrance, and deliver her ordnance with surgical precision, all while flying an aircraft that was attracting more hostile fire than a 4th of July fireworks display. Ghost armed her penetrator weapons, specialized munitions designed to punch through hardened targets before detonating. She had 4 of them, each one capable of destroying a city block if properly employed. The mission profile called for her to use 2 on the primary target and save 2 for the extraction phase. But as another SAM exploded close enough to shower her cockpit with debris, she realized that extraction was becoming increasingly theoretical. The facility's main entrance loomed ahead, a dark mouth in the mountainside surrounded by defensive positions that were pouring fire into the sky with desperate intensity. Ghost lined up her attack run, nodding the laser designators that were attempting to lock onto her aircraft, the streams of tracer fire that created beautiful and deadly patterns in the darkness, and the controlled chaos of an enemy installation under direct assault. She pickled off her first penetrator at a range of 2 miles, watching the weapon's rocket motor ignite as it accelerated toward the target. The munition struck the cavern entrance with a flash that briefly turned night to day, followed by a rumbling explosion that seemed to shake the entire mountain. Secondary explosions began almost immediately, suggesting that she'd hit something more volatile than simple rock and concrete. Ghost banked hard right to set up for her second attack run, but the enemy had learned from her first pass. They'd repositioned their mobile SAM systems to cover her most likely escape routes, and the volume of defensive fire had increased dramatically. It seemed as though every weapon on the mountain was now focused on the small section of airspace she occupied. The second penetrator found its mark in the facility's power generation plant, a target of opportunity that promised to complicate the enemy's ability to operate their defensive systems. The explosion was even more spectacular than the first, sending a pillar of fire hundreds of feet into the air and plunging large sections of the installation into darkness. But Ghost's celebration was premature. As she pulled out of her attack dive, a new threat appeared on her display: 4 aircraft rising from the mountain's hidden airstrip, their heat signatures indicating high-performance fighters designed for exactly this kind of engagement. She destroyed the static targets, but now she faced mobile opponents who could match her speed and exceed her maneuverability. The lead enemy fighter, Ghost's instruments identified it as a modified MiG-29, probably upgraded with Western avionics, locked onto her immediately. She could see the missile launch warning on her display even as she threw the Wraith into another series of evasive maneuvers. This time, however, her options were limited by terrain. The mountains that had provided concealment during her approach now boxed her in, creating a 3-dimensional trap with enemy fighters above and SAM sights below. Ghost made a decision that would have been considered insane by any pilot who hadn't spent years pushing the envelope of what was possible. Instead of trying to climb away from the threat, she dove toward the mountainside at maximum speed, using the terrain to break the enemy's missile lock while simultaneously setting up for an attack on the installation's remaining high-value targets. The maneuver worked, but barely. The enemy missile detonated against the mountainside less than 100 meters from her aircraft, the explosion close enough to crack her starboard engine intake and trigger warning lights across her instrument panel. The Wraith was damaged but still flyable, still capable of completing the mission if she could stay alive long enough. As she pulled out of the dive, Ghost realized that she'd been flying for her life for less than 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. The enemy installation was burning in multiple locations, its defensive systems degraded but not destroyed. She still had 2 penetrator weapons remaining, and according to her intelligence briefing, the primary laboratory facilities were buried deep enough to require both weapons to ensure complete destruction. But first, she had to deal with the fighters that were now positioning themselves for another attack run. Ghost checked her air-to-air weapons. She carried 2 AIM-120 AMRAAMs, advanced missiles designed to engage targets beyond visual range. It wasn't much firepower against 4 enemy aircraft, but it would have to be enough. She selected her first missile and waited for the targeting system to achieve lock. When the tone sounded in her headset, Ghost squeezed the trigger and watched the AMRAAM streak away toward the lead enemy fighter. The missile found its target in a burst of fire that briefly illuminated the entire valley, and the first MiG ceased to exist as a functional aircraft. 3 left, and they were closing fast. The dogfight that followed would never be recorded in any official history, never be studied at war colleges or analyzed by military historians. It existed in the dark spaces between acknowledged conflicts, fought by pilots whose names would never appear on any memorial wall. But for Ghost, it was the distillation of everything she'd trained for, everything she'd prepared for, everything she'd inherited from a father who died fighting the same enemy with inferior technology and impossible odds. The second enemy fighter died when Ghost managed to maneuver behind it during a climbing turn, her remaining AMRAAM finding its target despite the pilot's frantic evasive action. But the victory cost her. While she was engaged with the second MiG, the remaining 2 had positioned themselves for a coordinated attack that would be difficult if not impossible to defeat. Ghost found herself flying defensive, using every trick she'd learned in over a decade of aerial combat to stay alive against opponents who were skilled, determined, and operating in their own backyard. The Wraith's superior technology helped, but technology was no substitute for situational awareness and flying skill. She was good, better than good, but she was also alone, damaged, and running low on both fuel and options. The third enemy fighter almost got her. Ghost was pulling out of a defensive spiral when she noticed the MiG positioning for a shot that would be almost impossible to evade. In desperation, she pulled the Wraith into a vertical climb that brought her dangerously close to a stall, using the aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain altitude while the enemy pilot tried to match her maneuver. At the top of the